to Democracy. And then there's an abridged version as well.
Awesome.
And then a whole
Thank
bunch
you
on
so much.
extremism, etc.
You didn't read my
All of
review
these
of her book.
reports, I co-own the intellectual property. So feel free to distribute, use whatever you want. It's from my previous job. And there's a whole bunch of op-eds as well. So we can talk about them either offline
It's fine.
or at my lecture.
Yeah, you're fine.
Charles, it should be.
It's fine. Yeah, it may be an older rule, so it's fine. There is one in there.
Online version there is.
Yeah.
So you can.
All right. So we're going to begin in a moment.
No, Kathy, I did not get a chance to read it.
So this is the book that you really need to read.
So, good morning, everybody. We have two important lectures today. There's been a slight shift in the program. So, our second speaker is going to be Professor Katja
Mivorach. Blessed. Mivorach.
And Katja has been coming here, I don't know, almost since the beginning of our summer institute. She is a friend and a brilliant scholar, and she'll be speaking about anti-Semitism and curriculum, decentering identities, and curating syllabi. And we have Devin Randolph, who's a graduate of the Summer Institute. So you guys who are here for the first time, you can see you've become part of a network. Actually, Katja came as a scholar in residence originally too. So you can see that as we build the network, we bring in amazing people to speak. These two in particular. And Devin is, Katja is from the anthropology department at Grinnell University.
Grinnell College.
Grinnell College in the U.S. Devin is from the Department of Education in College, and he's going to speak about Anne and Emmett, confronting anti-Semitism, racism, and otherness through pedagogy. So Devin is going to begin, and then Katja will be second, and we'll have Q&A after.
Thank you, Charles.
Thank you both.
Thank you, and thank everyone for coming today. I will tell you some of the thoughts around the project that I created stem from my time here at ISGAP. Rabbi Mayor Muller and I were charged with creating a course in South Carolina that kind of looks at issues of anti-Semitism and race and otherness. Part of that project allowed us to work across the aisle with graduate students and undergraduate students. But our goal was to, how do we get educators to really think about decentering curriculums in a way that allows voice and lived realities to be present? And how do we do that in a way that educators get an opportunity to really share and understand their own stories? And sometimes I think we look at these two images of Anne and Emmett, and they tend to be always in conversations with each other. I think our goal and my research is figuring out how do we look at creating coalitions in a way that lessons that we can learn from the early 1940s onward. There are some clear takeaways that we can talk about in terms of what were some of the challenges with why the coalition did not really sustain itself. My interest is figuring out where the intersectionality in terms of future opportunities can coexist. So I want to be very clear, I'm not rehatching kind of some of the challenges that we see, but more so looking at what are some lessons that we can learn from those experiences and build upon. So this is kind of how I form in terms of who I am as a scholar, but more so as a social activist in terms of thinking about change. Oftentimes, I think we need to be very, very critical in terms of how we look at how there are issues and challenges that we face. And again, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced. We have to be very, very entrepreneurial in terms of how we think about curriculum and how do we design classroom environments in a way that our students help to inform the way we engage content. So you think about the traditional models of learning, and certainly at higher ed institutions, the professor comes in, the students sit quiet, and no one has an interaction. It's very top down. And so I think in my way of teaching my graduate and undergraduate students, my goal is to make sure that we're working at the intersection together and we're building upon that. But we also have to make sure that we answer some very clear questions early on when we talk about issues of race, when we talk about issues of when we talk about issues of racism, and also when we talk about issues of hate and oppression. And I think when we think about Ann and Emmett, we think about these two in conversations primarily because when we look at just how hate manifested and we think about how hate evolved, these are the symbols that I think that, and individuals that I think what we think about. And I think from a psychological aspect, when we think about humanity, we need to connect to something and someone. And these images are really ingrained in our hearts and our minds when we think about issues of hate and oppression, and also looking at how we change the narratives around those conversations. And so when I think about Ann and Emmett, I want to really think about it from the standpoint of asking you, what are some of the key similarities, or what are some of the things that you think about really quickly, just to kind of get a pulse of what some thoughts are in the room?
They were both murdered because of an immutable characteristic.
Correct.
They couldn't change about themselves.
Thank you, Ben. Anyone else? Yes.
Sort of iconic figures that represent like the persecution that each group has faced.
Great. And one other thought. Yes, ma'am.
There are works out today about Anne Frank that talk about who owns her, right? And the fact is, it's gone beyond, right? So I have some comments eventually when you've finished.
Great. You know, so I'm glad you mentioned that, and great comment. So there are a couple things when we think about this concept of property and we think about whiteness as property. We can look at intersections of critical race theory, and we also can look at cultural relative pedagogy to kind of help to inform how we look at Ann and Emmett. But this notion of reclaiming and this notion of property and ownership, I think, is something that we have to really talk through. When I did this project at the University of South Carolina, I was very clear that this course would not happen, primarily because of the conditions in South Carolina. And so initially when this course was developed, it had to be approved, right? Meaning someone had to say it's okay to talk and teach about this type of content in that narrative. And that's not really okay when we think about just the academic exercise of what intellectualism looks like and what learning looks like in spaces such as higher ed institutions. So the title of the course was Ann and Emmett: Confronting Antisemitism, Racism, and Otherness Through Pedagogy. I will talk a little bit about some of the methods that we use, that I use specifically in help engaging my students. But we really looked at the shifts in racism and anti-Semitism. We talked about convergence and divergence in looking at some of the challenges that we see. So there was some opportunity to talk about some of the historical challenges that we see. And I want to be very clear. So there's some quick assumptions that we can pull from the early 1950s. And some can say, well, you know what, the communities had different goals. And so that's why the coalition really kind of broke down. And we should never look into that opportunity again. I think that's a quick assumption that one can make. And I think that's dangerous when we think about what's really happening during the early 1930s and 1940s, certainly thinking about issues of immigration, specifically with African Americans as well as European immigrants coming to the United States, but also thinking about how cities spatially are being formed during this particular time when we talk about the banking system or we're talking about financing and these things happening. So I want us to think really clearly about not taking and making the assumption that there were different issues at play. I think that's a very cursory reading of it, but I think what happens when we think about how we start unpacking some of these issues, what we'll find is that the complexity had a lot to do with how one is defining themselves, but also looking at how one is defining their identity and how that's being mapped, giving some of the racial and given some of the migration patterns that is happening during that particular time. So some of the assignments that we actually created, one was the interview assignment, field studies, social media impact, reference guide and reflection. I'll talk about the social media impact, and then interviews very, very quickly, just to kind of give you an understanding of what we did. For the social media impact, we did what we call an image analysis. We looked at the story of Michael Brown, and we did that in a way where we looked at the 3 images of Michael Brown. We looked at it from the standpoint of how African-American males were being defined in media. And so when you look at the images of Michael Brown, you'll find that, and even if you type it on the internet now, what you'll find is there are 3 images that people know about Michael Brown. One is the infamous picture of him standing, throwing up a sign. The other is the picture of him being perceived very negatively. And then the last one was a picture of him with a robe on and a stole and a hat. But when you look at some of the social media contexts and images during that time, you would never find those positive reflections of Michael Brown being represented in the media. And so that's a danger, right? Because when we think about how our lived realities are being informed, sometimes there's a negative association that one can draw. And so we not only looked at the 3 images of Michael Brown. What we did was a deep Twitter social media analysis, looking at the hashtag If They Gun Me Down, which was a social media movement that looked at people of color, largely male, and looked at how they were represented. We also did a comparative analysis of looking at some of the Jewish moments in history, looking at the life of Anne Frank, and looking at some of the images that were also being depicted during that particular time, to give students a chance to really think about the impact of media and also how images are being formed during that time. So these were some of the projects that we created. So some of the findings that we had from our students when we did the interview assignment. So what we did was our class consisted of 20 students. And so our Jewish students and also our BIPOC community, our people of color, what we did was we asked them to interview students that were not in the class, faculty members, going to institutions such as synagogues, et cetera, grocery stores or business and communities, and having them have some very unique questions being formed. One thing I should say is we created a historical reference guide, and this reference guide was designed specifically for students who are coming to the topic in a new way and may not have the content to talk about anti-Semitism and racism. So there were some very big words that we started off with, but we asked the students to create a reference doc that historically we could go back throughout the course to really examine how they are understanding some of these large scale topics. Because in most spaces, we assume that our students come in with some general understanding and we build from that. But we also have to include them in those conversations so that way we can understand how we can create content that really helps them. And so the course itself was really a review for them to start thinking about it. But the reflection doc allowed us to really assess if we were really staying true to what we agreed upon. Did we agree upon some conversations about anti-Semitism and racism, but what were some of the terminologies that they may not understand and how they themselves are defining those terminologies across the course itself. And so, for example, they submitted 20 draft questions. I actually created some questions to help them kind of think through. And then they also looked at how certain themes and patterns between communities kind of emerge. And also giving them a chance to really get out of the classroom and go into the community that they define themselves and have them to work through that process. And the final outcome of this project was they had a paper and kind of like an oral presentation of lessons learned in thinking about how they are coming through some of the contents and findings from the students themselves. I won't read all of this, but I'll say that one thing stood out to me when students were talking to their family members about topics of anti-Semitism and racism. One of the things that stood out was when they spoke to their family members, one student specifically said, student C, that it was disheartening. After the interview, I wondered if my ignorance to my family views on Jewish people were because of my ignorance to my relationship between Black and Jews, or my unwillingness to see them in this negative light. And so I highlight this because when you are talking to your family, there's a different type of narrative at play, right? There's a relationship that you are building, but there's kind of like the known and unknown, meaning that you can feel comfortable around folks that you have connections with. And so when students are doing these interviews with their family members and they're thinking about these large scale topics, there's a very organic moment that's happening, and they're very truthful in terms of how that engagement looks. So for example, if you think about how often you sit at the table with quote unquote your family members, or how often you have your phone, you have your laptop, and you're not even sitting at the kitchen table, you're watching television, and there's so many movements that are happening. In this project, they're sitting, having an honest conversation about how they are defining racism, anti-Semitism, and it's not being alarmed, right? It's not being informed, or it's not being silenced in a way because it's not being performative towards a professor. It's actually a conversation that you're having with your family member. So you really get some honest discussions that's happening. And the last finding I'll say is one student mentioned, when I included that it was taught by an African American and a rabbi, their tone changed. My Nana became silent. My uncle made a negative remark about how Jewish people take away from the Black community. So this student was an African American student sitting at the table with their family and having a conversation. So there's a level of vulnerability that we have to really unpack. And I think that's where the transformation happens in this particular assignment, because of that takeaway. And that kind of really resonated with me from the interview from there. This was kind of the findings from another student. I'll just kind of skip ahead there. But we also did what we call the interview assignment. But one of the things that I wanted them to think about is, how might you do this assignment now after the course and take this assignment in other communities that you define that resonates with you? And let's have a follow-up after the course. So many of the students that took the course, we still have contact with them. Many of the students still keep in touch. And I think that's something that, as professors and scholars, when we think about our classroom spaces, we do not want it to be a one-off approach. Students sitting in our class, they leave and we never see them again. We want to make sure that we find ways to have sustainability, and creating this particular project allow that to happen in a natural way. Now, granted, students may reach out to us for recommendations. Hey, how you doing? I need you to write me a letter of recommendation. I'm applying to grad school, et cetera. We get those requests all the time, but when we have students asking us about how they're thinking about their own identity and how that's being informed by some of the large scale issues, and talking through that outside of a course, I think that's where you really see some powerful transformation that happens in that context. And I wanted to talk about this mandate. I won't read the actual quote, but this notion of being mandated to hide, or this notion of hiding in plain sight. So when you think about the story of Anne Frank or even Emmett Till, or even thinking about some of our own experiences when we are operating or walking in spaces that not being created by us or being defined by us, or having to reclaim those particular spaces that have been taken away from us, there's sometimes this feeling of this notion of hiding in plain sight. Like, I recognize as an African-American male in rural South Carolina, I recognize that there are still some spaces that I cannot walk in freely, or there's still this notion of otherness that I'm feeling. So when we think about otherness and we think about what that looks like, it's really being defined by other conversations, other identities, other labels that folks are putting on us. Whether we accept it or not, that's our choice, but it's really being informed. And so when I think about me being at a Research One institution, being one of the only male of color in an elementary program, and thinking about working with pre-service and in-service teachers, that are largely white females, I have to really understand that narrative. And we have to spend a lot of time unpacking what that looks like. So yes, we're talking about issues of whiteness, privilege, class, and I'm also being vulnerable and talking about my own experiences with privilege, right? I'm talking about my own experiences, despite the fact that I am in South Carolina. I have a credential that says that I'm okay, supposedly okay. It just depends, right? And so this mandate to hide, I think, was something that was also really powerful. And when we talk about love, and there's something, and I'll talk about some of the methods that I use, but when we talk about love and empathy, I think my students and I, we really talk about it from a standpoint of how do we think about creating a natural space, a natural community that we're working together. Love is something that you don't have to create a syllabus for, right? You don't have to have empathy and say, okay, let's look at the historical narrative of empathy and love. Love is something that we should do in the spaces that we create as students, as faculty members, as researchers, as scholars, et cetera, right? Love is something that should be very universal, right? Now, we may not like each other in terms of the content that we come across, right? There may be some areas that we disagree, but the practice that we have as educators should be informed from a place of caring, and a place of making sure that at the end of the day, what we can agree on is making sure that we work together to change some of the narratives that we see in communities that look like us. And finding the voice of our students, this was, again, part of the project. I wanted them to also look at how not only their experiences are being informed by this new content or familiar content, but also what are some of the lessons you learn, right? What are some of the reflections that you can take away? And so I'll read this one. It said, I hope to encourage my students to think critically. And so this course is for future teachers that was being designed. I don't know if I said that early on, but this is one of the reflections. I hope to encourage my students to think critically through the use of culturally relevant pedagogy. I want to empower students to recognize social justice in the world and then encourage them the critical thinking skills and good trouble actions to address those injustices and hopefully change them. And this was something that I felt was very, very powerful in terms of some of the findings in students' reflection. So a little bit about just kind of my research, but these are some of the practices that I think help inform me as I look at looking at some of the issues in the communities themselves. One of the projects that I created as I was finishing up my PhD was looking at the experiences of African American males who have been placed in alternative school, and looking at creating a project, a case study using art-based therapy, but also using their voices and their narratives to help understand how they're navigating their own experiences with schooling. Some of the intersections of research that I really draw from in creating this course and just how I'm thinking through my own experiences looking at critical race theory. Not sure how much you all are aware, but there's a contested conversation in South Carolina and actually even in North Carolina about critical race theory and banning the use from texts, from books. And so that's still being discussed, especially in South Carolina. But looking at culturally relevant and sustaining pedagogy, now not only talking about culture, but also looking at the impact that it has. And then looking at schooling experiences of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Charles said something the other day that made me think really about the wisdom when we think about the elders and we think about diaspora, like the wisdom that the community has only if we listen, right? There's knowledge, there's context, there's experiences that can really help inform our everyday way of being and our everyday ways of knowing. And so these are some of the methods that help inform me as I create this content, but also some of the methods that I hope teachers that I interface with also pull from, because we have to be very clear about how curriculum, how learning, how books, how texts are being designed and who is designing them. And we have to be very careful that we really unpack those in a way that we're very honest to say representation matters. And if I'm looking at a textbook and I'm working in a community in South Carolina and the demographics, sorry, not use demographics, but the representation of students in the field is largely people of color or the BIPOC community, they need to see themselves reflected in curriculum. They need to see themselves reflected in text. And because what are we teaching them, right? We're actually just redefining, we're really regurgitating things that doesn't help really inform learning. And so there are some very heavy conversations that we have, and we have to talk about it and be very clear. This may look different in your state, but I think in terms of South Carolina, we have to create communities that are culturally inclusive and diverse. They're not the same. We throw the word diversity around so much, but when we talk about inclusion, how do we include and make sure that we have an accurate representation of community? I think is something that is very powerful. And I'll save just kind of the questions afterwards, but thank you all for listening, and look forward to kind of Q&A afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You put a lot of pressure on coming up
So Katya,
before you.
That's the trick you'll have to learn. Always ask to speak last.
Fair enough.
Katya will speak, and then we'll have Q&A. So Katya, the floor is yours.
Okay, good morning. I thought that Devin's presentation, I think, Sade, I need you to take me back to where my USB PowerPoint is, or Daphne. I don't know how to do that. But if there are any burning questions for Devin, maybe at least one should be asked rather than having to wait. Is that okay with you, Charles?
Well, yeah.
Or you have it timed?
Well, yeah, I think.
You have us timed, because while this is happening, a question.
I just don't know how to use a Mac.
It might be quick.
Do you? I don't know how to use a Mac.
Did you train them in doing the interview research, and did you have ethics?
Yes, the ethics piece, yes, we had to do that. We were very clear that we did not want to create so much parameters because we felt like that would change the nature of the project. But we did have to make sure that there was approval from kind of our department chair.
Did you train them how to do the interviews and ask the questions?
Yes, what we did, we submitted draft questions, so it was 10 that we originally submitted that they kind of had an idea, but then they actually had to send their questions to us prior to going out into the community.
Did you talk to them at all about ethnographic
Yes,
research
how
and
do
how
I
oral
find-
histories are like?
How do we
give them
find
any
me?
context, or
My
is it
USB?
not?
Yep, so we talked a lot about the oral history
Is
component
Shonda-
of it,
she downloaded it?
and we wanted
She
them to kind of
downloaded
go
it?
in
Why?
spaces
Where
that
do
they
they
would not
show
be
up?
comfortable going
I
in.
don't
So the
know how to
oral
use a
history
Mac.
piece was included. And then from our qualitative and narrative component, we started talking about ethics and what that
So we
looks
just
like,
don't-
what's not to ask,
Okay.
what questions, what makes sense to you. These students were, it was graduate students and undergraduate students. So the graduate students projects are represented here. The undergraduate students, we did a different type of project with them because we didn't really want to throw them out into the field and kind of having that conversation without having the formal training. Yep. So I should have been clear. It was the graduate students project that was reflected here.
So did the undergraduates, sorry.
Ready?
I'm just, sorry I take a lot.
That's okay. You can keep doing that, and I will start. I'm going to speak. Some of what I have to say will complement some of Devin's remarks, and others will diverge. So this is a large group. If you can't hear me, let me know. And I'm going to ask for some audience participation, just because that's the way I do things. The topic is on anti-Semitism and curating syllabi. So the first thing that I want to do is decenter the United States. Okay, how many people here, if you could just show, because I don't know, how many of you are not teaching necessarily in the US or, okay, And how many of you were not born and raised your early period in the US? Okay, good. And how many of you speak more than one language? Good, okay. So it's easy then to descend to the United States. And and so among the theoretical principles here, the first one is that the United States, an American, and in this context, when I say American, I don't necessarily mean American citizens or residents, but American theories, unlike French theories did go across the Atlantic to the States, but American theories of racism, have been exported. They've been exported and they have been imposed and they've been adopted because some of them were cutting edge. In the 1980s and 90s, racial theories about racism, about whiteness were very cutting edge, and they were very, very important because they centered the way in which the idea of what is white, not just skin color, but the implications of what whiteness is and how it intersects with the law and how the law defined whiteness. That was very cutting edge because it hadn't been talked about. In fact, it had been talked about, but it hadn't been talked about throughout the 1960s. And so we have these bridges. So there's a chronology in academia. There's a chronology in theory making. And one of the challenges of theory making in 2022, and I'm 70. So all of a sudden I'm 70, but I really still think that I'm 40, except that my oldest son is 48. Okay, so those of you who have passed the age of 45 kind of know what I'm talking about. You look backwards and you hear things and it doesn't make sense what you're hearing. What is the point here? The point here is that students of those who had cutting theory of the 80s, those students were pretty good and they wrote pretty interesting things, but their students are not cutting edge. And therefore, we begin to read in academic literature things that just simply are, they're not wrong, but they're definitely not correct. That reflects itself, just because you mentioned critical race theory, and a word to critical race theory, and then I'll go through my PowerPoint very quickly as I can, and I don't mind being stopped when my time is up. Critical race theory came out of Harvard. A very, very, very smart, actually quite brilliant at the time, black students who were looking at critical theory, which was looking at class, and then looking at women and saying the law structures society. Laws get passed. So, for example, laws in colonial America determined that the child of an African slave woman would be a slave. Okay, so what does that mean over time? Given the fact that women who were of African descent from various places in Africa that had been brought to the United States, kidnapped to the United States, were raped. And they were raped and they got pregnant. And they, being pregnant, gave birth. This is before the we give birth. I still believe that women give birth. Okay, I'm sorry. Having had 3 children and had my legs up and had to push them out, women give birth. Okay, so before technology, women gave birth. Well, slaves are property, period. The property of property is property. It's your property, you own it. And over time, slaves in the United States in particular, it's true that South America, but South America is not my area of expertise, but you can look at the color range of people in South America and the Caribbean, you can see a color range in the United States. People defined as of African descent until the 60s ranged in color from very blonde, like my grandchildren, to very, very dark black. Who was a slave was not ever, ever determined by skin color. Who was a black person, who was an Afro-American, who was an African-American, terminology that changes over time, was not determined by skin color. This is a very recent phenomenon. Recent for me is not recent for somebody who's 30. So if in America today the color hierarchy is so strong that clearly if you look brown, if you look black, if you are young and you are male and you live in the city, you are far more at threat of being harassed by police if you're in the wrong neighborhood than if you are blonde or if you have white skin but your mother looks brown. So I want to put that out there as a very American phenomenon. If you are an illegal immigrant, if you are undocumented in Kenya because you have come up from South Africa looking for employment, you are going to be the target of harassment. So why do I bring that in a discussion of anti-Semitism? Because I want to underline a second key point. Harassment of the outsider comes in a variety of different shapes and forms. But you have to be literate in the society in which that changes. So in Europe, where we spend quite a bit of time, Roma are recognizable. Well, a few weeks ago, we live in Des Moines, Iowa. Somebody taps me on my shoulder outside of a big store called Whole Foods. And it was a surprise because in America, people don't just tap you on your shoulder. So I looked behind me, and it took me literally a split second, but in that split second, I forgot where I was. This was a person who I see all the time in Paris. She was a Roma woman asking for money, but it was like this moment of, where am I? So Roma in West Des Moines are understood differently, perhaps, than Roma in Paris. One is recognized as different, other, like Ukrainian refugees now, but in West Des Moines, this is a white person who must be poor. Okay, so you have to be literate in what you're looking at. This, what I've said now, prefaces the idea that you need to know who is your audience. When you're teaching, you want to know who is the audience. And you cannot presume, I think all of you know this, but you cannot presume what the students in your classroom look like for what their background is. And their background may be very personal. They may not even think about some of the things as part of their background, but it doesn't necessarily enter into the classroom. It doesn't necessarily enter into a discussion. And this is going to play itself out very differently in European and African and Middle Eastern countries than in the US. But in the US, which I will go back and forth through, the US has a binary way of thinking. That binary is being shaken up. Over the last 20 years, it has shaken up because there are more and more immigrants whose children were born, if not born in the States, raised in the States. And that's a function of the United States changing its laws of immigration. So you have lots of Africans, you have many people coming from South Asia, not just India. South Asia does not mean Indian, even though often it is, the same words. Pakistani and Indians may have a common restaurant, which they do in Des Moines, but that won't happen in Brooklyn because Hindu and Muslim in Brooklyn are very aware of being different from each other. Palestinian, Jewish, and Palestinian Muslims and Jewish Israelis may share a restaurant in certain parts of the world where there's no political conflict to think about. So they both are Middle Eastern. That's not going to happen in Brooklyn, New York. There are questions to ask on the first day of class, which I always ask, and I would have done it if you were a smaller group, but if each of you could just think to yourselves, where are your people from? Not with whom do you identify, but create in your mind a geographical map over time. Now, Prussia does not exist today, so you can't say, well, I think my great-grandparent is from Prussia, because most of the people who are under the age of 25 don't think about Prussia. In fact, they probably don't have any relatives who came from Prussia that are alive today or when they were children. So I ask my students, where are your people from? Not with whom do you identify? And the purpose is to have a sense of geography. Okay? I will have to say, don't just say Ireland. Because if you're Catholic or if you're Protestant, that is of significance. But I say that because most of the students who are Jewish in the class are not necessarily going to say that they're Jewish. So I'll have students who say Poland, and I'll have to repeat the question, Polish what? Okay? Now history and politics don't necessarily go together. Ukraine was extraordinarily anti-Semitic. 2 years ago, we were able to discuss that in a classroom. This semester, we're not going to discuss it in the classroom because it will be too complicated for me to explain how anti-Semitism functions in Ukraine when Ukrainians on TV and in media images are clearly being bombed and bombarded by the very people, Russia, who were extremely important to Jews of my grandparents' generation, because Russia, with all of its problems, was very important as an enemy of Hitler, even with the Stalin-Hitler pact. But basically, the Soviet Union were friends of the Jews, and everybody was happy when they marched in. Okay, so if I'm making it complicated, I intend to make it complicated because this is summer, this is vacation, and life is not chronological, it's up and down. And as educators, this is what you need to be thinking about, how complicated and contradictory it is before you make your syllabus. Because you can't fit it all into the syllabus. So clearly, if this was my college classroom, I wouldn't be this complicated. And I see that Noah is there, and I have you in here in my papers. I'll explain that in a few minutes. What is it about the idea that Jews are white? Why is that a big contributor to an inability to understand the relationship between anti-Semitism as a fact and racism as a fact, and that the two overlap and are in fact exactly the same? They manifest themselves differently in different places. Anti-Semitism is a form of racism. Islamophobia is a form of racism. Racism is when you assume permanent features of difference and inferiority. So I want to say there are 4 basic topics that if you need to think about how do you connect the dots of what I'm saying, because it's all over the map. One is bloodless racism, which is subtle. So an extreme example of bloodless racism is a few years ago, I had a student in my class who, at the end of the semester, referenced the fact that she was Jewish. She never said it in the beginning of the semester. In fact, she was like all the other students who were American and who had white skin in my class. And if I recall correctly, her background, when she said countries of origin, she didn't have a country of origin that was, I think she was 5th or 6th generation American. So nothing about her being Jewish came up. But at the end of the semester, where she had a little bit of confidence, she then says that she had studied Merchant of Venice in her first year reading course. And when she wanted to raise the topic of Shylock and anti-Semitism, the professor said, no, this is a course about Venice. And she had no answer. She didn't know how to answer. And so I said, well, how would you answer now? And she said then, well, I would be able to say, well, in Professor Koch's class, we discussed Merchant of Venice and we discussed anti-Semitism, and so I think it's pertinent. So that's an example of subtle racism. The professor didn't think anything about it, about her answer, and the student didn't know how to say anything. A second similar example is I had a student who very knowledgeable about Jewish studies. He studied independently with me. He created a major called Israel Jewish Studies, which he had to argue for and which I supported with the administration. I encouraged him to take a class on Hannah Arendt. Most of you have heard of Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt, in a very, very different way from Anne Frank, is also appropriated. In my opinion, she is appropriated. How is she appropriated? She's taught the way Walter Benjamin sometimes is taught, as if they're not Jewish. You know, but somehow that disappeared from who they are and why the intellectual questions that they raised were asked. So I sent him to this class, and a few weeks later I said, how's your class on Hannah Arendt? And he said, oh, I dropped it. Oh, why did you drop it? He said, because on day 1, the professor said, well, Hannah Arendt, of course, was an anti-Zionist, and of course we understand why. In the middle of a sentence, that wasn't the sentence, that was the middle of the sentence. So no, the Hannah Arendt was never going to be discussed in terms of her ambivalence toward the creation of a Jewish state where all the Jews would be in one place, which actually is something that my grandmother thought. My grandmother was from Tarnów originally. Wow. No discussion of a context of Hannah Arendt, no discussion of a context of why during the trial of Eichmann, she spoke about the banality of evil. No understanding the fact that the New Yorker magazine, where Hannah Arendt wrote, had no letters of the editor to the editor. So there was no feedback, which is not the case today. That completely disappeared. Now, was the professor an anti-Semite? No, she's not an anti-Semite. She's just ignorant in this topic. But what makes it more complicated is the fact that she doesn't acknowledge it. Okay? So bloodless racism is when there is willful ignorance, in my opinion. This is my opinion. Okay? It's when you may be told something, you may tell the person, you know, that's quite racist or that's quite anti-Semitic. And they will look at you and say, well, I don't think so. And nothing that you will say will persuade them to rethink their idea. That is bloodless racism. The second point here, anti-Semitism and racism, and I've just alluded to it, is that it is often spoken about, especially in the United States, as if there are Jews and then there's BIPOC. Well, that leaves out Noah. That leaves out me. That leaves out Jews of North African descent in the United States. That leaves out Jews from Ethiopia. So again, let me give you a small anecdote, which is a very recent anecdote from just last week. I have a young woman who's a friend of mine. She's not so young anymore. She's doing a fellowship in the United States. She is of Ethiopian origin. She's Israeli. Her daughter is born and raised in Israel. Her daughter is Israeli, very proud of her Ethiopian heritage, Ethiopian Jewish heritage, just as Moroccan Jews are proud of their Moroccan Jewish heritage, and so forth. I can go through the list of all the countries that are not European. This 11-year-old is in a public school, an elite public school, but it's a public school. Most of the children in the class are white, and one day her daughter comes home and says to my colleague, Shula, in Hebrew, and then she uses the English. So in Hebrew, she asks, are white people bad? But it's the white people that she says in English. And her mother's kind of taken aback and, oh, what do you mean? Yes, well, in class, they told us about how bad white people treat black people. Now, mind you, this 11-year-old thinks of herself as Israeli, of Ethiopian origin. She looks in the mirror. She's very proud of her very brown skin, but she doesn't see herself as a black person. It hasn't come up in those terms. There's more to the story that's, we don't have enough time to go into it, but the point of the story is that here is an 11-year-old learning in this moment to be a black person. And I have seen that happen with African students in my class who, they won't say that. There's no space ever to say, well, I'm actually American. My parents are immigrated from Kenya. Of course, when I'm outside, I am identified as a black person. And in that context, being black is not existential. It is political. Yeah. And so this is another point that I want to make, that the racial categories of the US that have been exported outside, they are racialized, and they are spoken of as if somehow race was a static thing. So let me figure out how to do this PowerPoint. These are Jews. All of these people in this picture are Jews. So can you say Jews of color are different? Which are the white people here? That's what I would like you to think about. That when you make expressions that use and, like women and minorities, as if somehow minorities exist on their own, and then they're women, that is the same thing that happens when we are so accustomed to saying Jews and. So I want to suggest to you that it really didn't matter in the camps what the and stood for. And so if you write down a film that if you have not seen, I highly recommend it. I don't necessarily recommend showing it to students because I don't think young people today quite understand it in the US. That is not the case, I would argue, for Europe. Okay? And that's the film Son of Saul, which received an American Oscar, and which in the American version translates everything which is said. But where we saw it in Paris, only what Saul understood is translated in French. Everything else is not, which means you experience the cacophony of the camps, which was the point. There were some 20 languages. Jews spoke different languages. Not all Jews speak Yiddish. My grandparents, who were from Austria, my grandmother was born in Tarnów, but her father was Aberbach from Germany, and they moved to Vienna. They understood Yiddish. My mother didn't understand Yiddish at all. German and Yiddish are not the same thing. So if our students don't understand that, then going in, what they see is white, Jewish, and then everybody else. Well, if they see Palestinians, which they do, who are blonde with blue eyes, not just Druze, and you say, but isn't that person white? No, they're oppressed, so they can't be white. So now we have a new definition of whiteness. Oftentimes that seems to be too complicated to deal with. I've said that to other people who've said, yes, but it's too complicated. You know, how can I explain all that in my 14 semesters? I said, well, you have to start out with that. So one starts out with the fact that Jews are a global people. If one starts out with Jews are global people, and this is not in the correct order, so it doesn't matter. The point here is if we start out with Jews are global, then we can speak about the place of Jews in different spaces. In India, where there are 3 different groups of Jews, Jewish communities, not very many left today, but that's the history of India, and Jews were at the forefront, actually, of their cinema. And there is a movie about that called Shalom Bollywood, which is a very lovely film. Then the relationship in India was very positive. But in Eastern Europe, it was not positive. In Iraq, there were hundreds of years where it was positive, and then it wasn't positive. In Iran, there were hundreds of years when it was positive, except for those moments like during Purim when we celebrate Queen Esther, which I introduce to my students. I tell them about Queen Esther as part of history. It doesn't matter if it's true or not true. The point is, there was a moment in which Persia was significant. Persia is definitely not in Europe. Okay? Dov Baruchov was a Marxist Zionist, and in the time that he wrote, and I think it's appropriate for even today, too many people who identify as Jewish or who will say, as a Jew, I don't support Israel, and various comments of variations on that. And Dov Baruchov said, nobody asks to kill themselves off as a people. So I bring this in to suggest that this is a good comment for students to have in their book. I love your book of vocabulary. I have a vocabulary list not to use, but this is a vocabulary to use. Race is one of the words not to use. Racism is one of the words to use. Racecraft is one of the words to use, the making of race. But this idea of only to us Jews have self-appointed physicians had the audacity, the shamelessness to preach national suicide. So, a word on Zionism. If Zionism still means the self-determination of the Jewish people with Israel as its actualization, one can still be extremely critical of the Israeli government, of Israeli policies, of Israeli parties. And the answer to BDS does not necessarily have to be a very lengthy one. I don't really pay a lot of attention to people whose views I think do not merit a counter-argument, particularly when I don't think that their power is as powerful as we might make it seem. And in that context, BDS is very much of an academic, campus-oriented argument. When you leave campus, most people are like here in Oxford. They're going about their business. They really only care, did they get home on time? Or can they pick their kids up? Can they pay the mortgage? They're not really thinking about anybody but their own small world. So sometimes we can make a mountain of a molehill. And I think that's important as academics to recognize that students spend time in our classroom, but we spend more time thinking about them than they think about us, quite frankly. So coming back just to race very quickly, when my grandparents were finally able to get a visa to the United States, because my grandmother had a sister in the US who begged the doctor that she worked for to sign the affidavit which is still routine for coming to the United States to get a green card. You still need somebody to sign on for you. Parenthesis here, this is an opportunity to tell students as well, how do you gain entry to the US? You go to the website of Homeland, and you will see that the rules are the same if you're coming from Ireland or England or Germany or Africa or India or any of the countries in Africa. Wherever you're coming from, there are rules. Are there exceptions? Most definitely. If you have $1 million, you can get a green card almost immediately. Most people don't have $1 million. But in the 1930s, Jews could only enter, and they were listed as a race. And so my grandparents' passport and the documents on their entry list them as Hebrews. Not religion. I have my students read, and again, this is the push I'm talking about now, is to undermine and to remove the vocabulary of white Jews. Okay? So there are Jews who in the United States are racially classified in the categories as white. And ironically, so are Ethiopians, because it's Northeast Africa. But I want students to understand the notion of race and race categories. So in the 19th century, when the ideas of racial categorization, racial taxonomy were being developed, Jewish anthropologists thought about the racial typology of Jews. And these two articles, which appear in the same journal, I have them read. I recommend it for all of you, just to have a memory of how things change. So the discussion here is not, are they good, are they bad? There's reference to how people look different. There's reference to the black Jews of Ethiopia. But the vocabulary is, these are all Jews, and the different typology is a reflection of the diaspora. So why are Jews different? Well, Jews are different because they were expelled. And so they moved to wherever they moved, and they took on many of the characteristics of local people, and that's why Jews of Ethiopia don't look like Jews from Copenhagen. On race, again, students do not, young people today do not know and understand 5 minutes. Okay, I'll do 6 and I'll be done. I'll do this fast. You're all smart. Okay, so they have to see the category. It's not enough to read about it. You have to actually see it and put it into practice. You have to see what it meant to have citizenship taken away. You have to see, you being the generic, you have to see visual images of documentaries and movies where Jews are pushed, like my mother's uncle, pushed out into the street to scrub the streets. We just came back from Vienna. It's the only time I will have visited Vienna. Maybe I'll go back once more when my grandchildren are a little bit older. And I could not get over the fact that in the different houses where my grandparents lived, people stood at the window and watched and laughed and threw things at the Jews on the streets, doctors, lawyers, as well as working class people. Getting away from Europe, North Africa is part of the Holocaust story. The biggest challenge in American institutions is that everyone thinks that you can begin a syllabus and focus on the Holocaust and move forward to anti-Semitism. So what does that do? That reinforces the idea that the Holocaust was only a European event. This is not to minimize the people in my family, including for whom I'm named, who were murdered in the camps. But if the Nazis hadn't been stopped by the Americans and the British in Tunisia, then the story would have automatically incorporated North Africa and the Middle East. That has to be made from the beginning. So Victor Peres, who won a Olympic award for boxing, was from Tunisia. He was in France. He was deported. He was murdered in Auschwitz. This is an image of Jews in Tunisia. The camps began. There is an excellent film called I just forgot the name. I'll send it. On Tunisian Jews, The Wedding Song. The Wedding Song. It's from a French director, and it maps a Jewish family, a poor Jewish mother and her daughter living in a poor neighborhood, and what happens as the Germans enter. I've already said about race as a classificatory system. One has to also be able to introduce into the classroom vocabulary and how it changes. We hear the word ethnicity, right? The word ethnicity does not appear in any documents basically before the 1970s. That's not the terminology that's used. White ethnics and white ethnicity is a function of World War II, and anthropologists like Ashley Montagu, who had changed his name from a very Jewish name, he was British, saying race can't be cleaned up. It's not like queer and gay today. Race can't be cleaned. We need a new term. And the term that he came up with was ethnicity, from the Greek ethnos, nations. So, I have this list here. I've discussed some of this. An important case, I recommend, you can take a picture of it. Have your students, if you're talking about American anti-Semitism, don't have them read the case. Definitely do not have them read about the case. It will all be a distortion, a misrepresentation. Have them listen to the case with the transcript, which is online. And then ask them the question when they've completed it. Did you hear the word Jews as an ethnic group? It's not there. And some of you have heard about the way in which today there are efforts to broaden civil rights definition of Jews on campus. Trump wanted to define them as a nation. Jews got upset. But the fact is that the case that I just showed you already indicated that, Jews are seen as a racial group under the law from the 19th century. What happened between then and between today is this effort to be white, to be identified as white with Jews as a religion, which again then reinforces the idea that there are Jews, and then there are people of color, and then there are Jews of color. And when you have that slippage, you do not have any political context within which to then move forward. And here I will really, cut to the chase. You get easily to Jews are white, Jews are European, Jews came from outside of the Middle East because they obviously were not from Arabia, and therefore, like other white European colonizers, Jews took over Palestine. That is a distortion of history. But if you start there, you cannot persuade your students that it's a distortion of history. You have to start out with Jews as a global people, just as for me, I'm older than you, so I can't use the term African American, which few people remember was introduced by Jesse Jackson in the 1980s. So I have to say, as a black person who is Jewish, as a Jewish person who in the United States is identified as black, there's a history to why today we associate blackness with a color rather than blackness with an existential political state that was defined by law. In 1921, Virginia passed an act. It was the first of the one-drop rule acts. And the act specifically said, if you have a black ancestor, it didn't use the word black, it used the word African ancestry, then you were a Negro. Color never figured into the law. That takes a lot of effort to explain. But if you explain it with law, with the laws, with the actual laws, it is easier to digest. And that's where critical race theory is not an enemy of those who are trying to bring anti-Semitism to the fore. Actually, critical race theory is an asset. It is how you use it, because it is the use of looking closely at the law and the policies that stem from legal action, such as determining that Jews entering the United States in the 1930s were identified as a Hebrew race, to today where, Jews are just Jews, and the assumption is that Jews are white. I want to show one last picture, and I want to say that as far as I am concerned, and we can open this up obviously for discussion, Louis Farrakhan is less of a problem. You give him attention, you make him a big issue. He does not have the power. in the United States to make anti-Semitism a #1 issue for American Jews of any color and any national origin. But QAnon and the conservative Republicans, they are a definite problem. Follow the changes. Who could have imagined that in the United States, someone like me and others could have sympathy for Dick Cheney? Evil himself? Christian evangelicalism today is a major problem in the United States. And I want to end with paying attention to the right, because the left does not have that power. Not in the US, not in France with Mélenchon. And quite frankly, and I shouldn't put them in the same sentence, so there's a period, and the capital new sentence is, unfortunately, in Israel, the left has lost its power. And there's a whole new configuration of political dialogue and discourse that is emerging. So if you have students, and if you're in the United States, if you have students in other countries or the US who are pro-BDS and you are upset about that, which we should respond to me, the response is get involved with those people on the ground who live there, who live in Israel, who live in the Middle East, who are going to be affected by what happens, and participate with those organizations and groups whose political ideologies you have some affinity for. And that is a way to be engaged. That is not a way to disengage and say, Israel shouldn't exist, which for me is the ultimate in anti-Jewish and anti-Jewish attitude, and it does not solve the Palestinian question. So.
All right, so I know there's going to be a lot of questions. I'm going to start off. First of all, both of your presentations were amazing and thought-provoking, so thank you very much. So I'm going to start with some kind of maybe eclectic thoughts. As you were speaking, the last few days I've been thinking about Stephen Biko and Black consciousness. And I find it very disturbing. So I find it very disturbing that once again or continuously Jewish identity is being defined by others. And I think for those of us who are trying to understand anti-Semitism, to assess it, to decode it, to map it, we also have to become, I think, conscious and aware of what is Jewish identity from a Jewish perspective. From a Jewish perspective, who are we as a people? What are our concepts of peoplehood? What does it mean to be Jewish from a Jewish perspective or even Jewish perspectives? And I think that has to be really, I think, ingrained in our consciousness that there is an amazing depth of knowledge and wisdom and continuity when it comes to defining who we are from a Jewish perspective. And it's really, it's chutzpah. And in 2022, people still think that they can define us. And we are being defined. This discourse is not a Jewish discourse. This discourse is entirely non-Jewish. Entirely, not 99%. Our terms of reference of race, of whiteness, of not whiteness, this is not Jewish. And what does it mean to those of us engaged in the struggle in fighting anti-Semitism and other forms of hatred when this is not even on the table? So my questions, and you provoked me to think about this.
I always do, huh?
It's amazing. That's why it's wonderful that you're here and part of Israel.
Thanks.
Really
Thanks.
So, you mentioned hiding in plain sight. So the light bulb goes off in my head. That's the canard to dismiss anti-Semitism that African Americans experience, which you've alluded to briefly. So this vulgar, profound, foundational part of American society, from slavery to Jim Crow to segregation, and police, and all this stuff that is part of the American condition, the African American, but American condition today. But then when people compare, which is a bad thing to compare, Jewish ethics teaches us that anti-Semitism is bad, but we can hide in plain sight. We're white, we fit in. It's interesting. And it's also interesting, Katya, that in a sense, it's great to show the diversity of Jewish communities and Jewish peoplehood, but it's interesting in a sense that you mentioned Mizrahi, Ethiopian, and North African Jews who are not white from the American lens, right? But it's the Ashkenazi Jews who the American society defines as white today that suffered most profoundly, maybe more so than, I don't know, not good to compare, more so than other Jewish communities. They were exterminated because they weren't white, but the American society, and all of us are on the table, the default position is somehow they're white. But they suffered more racism than any other Jewish community I can think of. I'm throwing these stuff out and I want to hear you guys respond. So that's a thought. You mentioned that American notions of racial identity is being exported, and it is throughout the world. And I think Jewish communities, Israel is affected by this exportations of identity. But how is it being exported? Who exports it and in what venue? Is it the music industry? And if it's the music industry, how is race portrayed? How is gender portrayed? How is materialism portrayed? So what is being exported? And I know within the African American community, some music is intended to be consumed internally, and to speak to young African American people. And then what happens when those messages are turned and consumed by other demographics? What does that reinforce? What does that do in capitalist music industries? And one more thought. So it's sort of capitalism, music. Yeah. I'll end it there, but I really would love to hear your thoughts. Hold it.
Can I just answer first?
Sure.
For one thing, you said, how is race portrayed? And that's precisely the slippage that those of us who educate have to be very aware of, not of how we speak. Race can't be portrayed because it is a taxonomy of differentiation, of classification. You can portray racial categories, and if you say racial categories, you still need to identify what are the criteria for the racial categories. What are the racial categories in a society that speaks about black people or Negroes with a capital N? That was the language of the time. It took a long time for the New York Times to capitalize, by the way, and young people think that it's a bad word.
Or Ashkenazis is white.
When we move to how did the Jews in America become white? Okay, so a book that I recommend those of you interested in the United States, and it is two critical books. One is Matthew Fry Jacobson. That is a must-read. It's Matthew Fry Jacobson, Whiteness of a Different Color. That is a must-read because he maps out in a way that complements and is more historical, and it doesn't contradict Karen Brodkin, how the Jews became white. Jews don't enter the U.S. as white, but they do enter with a certain privilege. And today's American Jewish community, and this begins already in the 50s, it begins maybe earlier, it is a fact. It is a fact in the Midwest, because I'm in the Midwest. American Jews who identify as American Jews, which my mother never did, for instance, identify as white. All one has to do, and I had a student do this a few years ago, is do an analysis of it's in English, the forward. If you do an analysis of the forward and you just put in the words white Jew, you will not find it in Yiddish at all. It started as a Yiddish paper. You will find that in the 1990s, it appears, it accelerates, and today it's ubiquitous. white Jews. What does that possibly mean to Anne Frank? And the problem with using Anne Frank as an example is that she has been so appropriated that her Jewishness has become like yogurt, which is a horrible thing to say. So when I show this example, Miami Jews are very diverse. Anybody from Miami knows that. But New York Jews, Midwest Jews, and a final example for the Midwest. My son, my children are born in Israel. My younger son, whose last name is Azulai, those of you who know anything about names know that Azulai is always a Moroccan last name, was asked, and he looks like a typical Israeli, and he's not particularly brown, he's kind of tan, but he was asked in Omaha by an American Jew who thinks that they represent Jews, and he identifies definitely as white, says to my son, so are there brown Jews in Israel? Now, if we think that that's a silly statement because the man who asked it is old, I was told by somebody in Des Moines, actually the head of a very important organization who had visited Israel, who herself was very, very blonde, to me does not look Jewish, very blonde, very tall. She went to Israel, she was impressed, and she was surprised that she was told that there were many Jews that in America would be seen as Jews of color. That was a surprise. So all I'm suggesting, Charles, is that when we are teaching, we do not start out with the very things that will reinforce the idea that most Jews are white, and then we've got these other people to give you as examples. If that's your starting point, you can never go back. So the third book to suggest is Eric Sundquist, and I've just lost the title of his name, but you can find it easily, S-U-N-D, Matthew Fry Jacobson, Eric Sundquist, and the third is going to be Barbara Fields. Whiteness of a Different Color for Jacobson. Eric Sundquist, S-U-N-D-Q-I-S-T. He also talks about Jews and blacks, and he points out that blacks never had someplace to go back to, and Jews did. So the trajectories were a problem. I just forgot it, but you're all on Google, so I can find it in a minute. And the third, which explains American racism in socioeconomic terms, and is probably a landmark and the most important book you'll read about American racism, and that's by Barbara Fields and Karen Fields, Racecraft. And she defines racecraft as the process through which racism, which is an evil, okay, the process through which racism becomes race. And the analysis, the core of the analysis can actually be transported with adjustment to other societies in which racism functions. Rwanda, okay, so Rwanda and Yugoslavia can be paired. Anytime you can slaughter people and you want to dehumanize them and annihilate them, that is racism in its most extreme form. And it is never simply about skin color. So America has fetishized skin color, and the other part is that the South is very Christian. But not all black Americans are Christian. Not all black Americans have been Christian. Some black Americans are Catholic, and that's very different if you're from Montana and black, and if you're from Mississippi. And too often in the US classroom and in writing, blackness is described in ways that leave out my Jamaican family. They don't exist. They don't find a place.
So what I'll say really quickly, so when you think about during the time of emancipation and slavery, and you think about the Emmett Till lynching, there were roughly about 600 black women and children that were lynched in Mississippi. So obviously there could be other examples, right? So when we think about Anne Frank and Emmett Till, I would push back and say that Anne Frank was to Germany what Emmett Till was to America, Black America specifically. The images that Mamie Till uses, if you look at the famous Jet magazine cover and you think about the media, was very intentional, right? When you have the distorted image of Emmett Till. In my course, I'm very clear to not to treat or compare tragedies, because I don't think it honors the experiences. And the other piece of it is I think the lived realities are very important. So how students are understanding their own identity and how they themselves are mapping out community in terms of how that's being defined by them, because I think that that gives an opportunity to really get some really healthy discussions, and I think that's really important. What I will also say is when we think about the social construction of race, I think that's something that I am very clear that it's not a biological impact, right? It's very socially informed. And then what do you do with that? Because you only have a certain amount of time in class to really get to some of the topics and really some of the conversations you want to get to as a faculty member. But I do agree that when we are looking at anti-Semitism and racism, we do have to treat them not as similar narratives, but make sure that we honor the experiences of both.
So we have a lot of questions.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for your talks. This has been incredibly inspirational. David, I would just like to ask you what questions did your students ask and what questions were offered on the question bank?
Yeah, I'll definitely upload them later. One was this concept of race first instead of racism. And I think there was easy to jump to kind of looking at race instead of understanding the physical characteristics of how it's being defined in the South, which I think is important. And then the other question was, how do I have a conversation about anti-Semitism and racism with my family members who have very starch realities or very informed perceptions about both? And some of them are largely negative, to the point where I had a parent call and say, I don't want to be in a class being co-taught by a rabbi, an African-American male. That was something that we were informed about, and it was very concerning to us because they were more concerned about the type of content in the course itself that was being discussed. And then the word critical race theory actually is never in the syllabus itself. And that was more intentional because if we would have used that, the course would not be approved, unfortunately. Yeah.
So we have a lot of questions, so I'm going to collect two at a time. So Chloe and then Harry, please be concise.
Okay, very quickly, I'm going to provide an alternative reading on the point that the Jews have had no role in determining the terms of critical race theory, because I would suggest that the critical race theory is in many ways the heir of critical theory, which was of course written primarily by Jews, so Adorno, Horkheimer, Lowenthal, Fromm, and this notion of unpacking the dialectical materialism of the class struggle as it pertains to institutions. So that's one sense. In another sense, picking up on the anti-essentialism and performativity of Judith Butler in its deployment. So again, Jews are determining the terms, but the theoretical lineage is being stripped away. So anti-Semitism operates at the level of the structure of the theory, not just at the content. So it's actually more pernicious than we may assume, just a suggestion. But I would like...
Why more pernicious?
Because the impact of Jewish thinkers and the ways in which their theories are actually utilized in order to unpack the complexity of their Jewish identity is stripped of its context in order to take the techniques to unpack a completely different type of set of theoretical concerns. So the reason for that is because critical race theory is not a body of theoretical work. I'm so pleased that you drew attention to its legalistic heritage, but it's more of a praxis. There's no manual for critical race theory apart from, I guess, intersectionality from Crenshaw in 1982. Instead, in the way that we may have texts about like post-structuralism or queer theory, things like that. So one reason for that is because it's part of this wave of thought which rejects like texts. So like we think of fourth wave feminism, consent culture, there's no text. And the reason for that is the internet, right? Because these conversations are taking place on the internet. This is where people are learning the vocabulary, memes are being shared. So in both of your work, like what is the role of the internet in this body of work?
Just a few remarks I'd like to hear your thoughts on. I will be as concise as possible. In regards to Anne Frank, I think we alluded to Anne Frank and the way Anne Frank's memory is perhaps instrumentalized for a universal purpose. That is to say, when we talk about racism, when we talk countering racism, that is, promoting diversity, equality, and so on, we use images of Anne Frank, and this is also something which is also done more broadly with the Holocaust itself, and with colonial history. It's instrumentalized to say, well, you know, let's promote these values of diversity and equality and so on. I just wonder, though, your perspective. For me, my perspective, I'm deeply concerned by the, if you will, the de-Judification or the dilution of Anne Frank's Jewishness for this sake. And I just wonder, how do you reconcile, or how do you go about trying to show Anne Frank as a universal figure, but also as a Jewish figure? And I'd also say, sorry, I forgot your name.
Katya.
Katya, thank you. By the way, thank you for both really interesting talks. I want to make something clear that I think often gets lost, is that the Jews in the Third Reich were persecuted on the basis of a lie. That is, that Jews are a distinct race. Jews do have a distinct kind of racial features. And I just really don't like the idea of us thinking that Jews should be defined with ethnic characteristics. I don't like the idea that Jews have kind of distinct ethnic features. I think Jews constitute a religious civilization. I think, of course, religion is a part of that civilization. It encompasses a range of other things. But the idea that we constitute a distinct ethnic or biological minority, I think is wrong. And lastly, I told you it'd be as precise as possible. Lastly, I just want to push back against the idea that conservatism in America. I'm speaking as a European, so I'm going to say it from a European perspective. But conservatism in Europe, the threat to Jews in France, you alluded to Jean-Luc Mélenchon, you said this is much of a threat. Well, he came third in the last French election, presidential election. Jeremy Corbyn was a real threat to British Jews at the last general election here. The left, it seems, present a real threat to Jews. And actually, if you look at places where Jews are safer, it's where there are more conservative governments.
Well, I don't think Orban, I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt you, because Orban in Hungary, who is a close friend of Trump, who has just been celebrated by what has now taken over the GOP, which is my reference to Dick Cheney, who used to be Mr. Evil, and now we're all applauding the fact that he spoke out. Orban just recently spoke about not wanting mixed race in Hungary, and he was not alluding to African Americans. He was not alluding to Africans from the continent of Africa. He was not alluding to South Asia. His allusion was to George Soros. And George Soros, none of my younger students know who he is. I don't blame them for not knowing. Why should they know? He's not a famous name in the States. But that kind of conservatism is the kind of conservatism which, as has been said, is fascist. Fascism is the threat. So yes, Jeremy Corbyn was a threat. Jeremy Corbyn is a horrible person. Jeremy Corbyn has also been outed from the Labour Party.
Corbynism hasn't, though.
No, it's not.
No, but the question is, where do you put your emphasis? And when, so we could continue with this kind of a conversation of who is worse, but my concern is who has the ultimate power? Who will finally have the ultimate power?
Can I just say, had we had proportional representation in the UK and not first past the post, talk about how Corbyn would have been Prime Minister.
Yeah.
That may be, but the end of it is that he wasn't, and Trump was a president.
Yeah.
Israel and the Jews, I must say.
Yeah.
So
that's a reality, and these are facts. He might be a horrible person, but he was the best for the Jews.
That is an opinion. That is an.
I think we cannot politicize. Excuse me. I think we cannot politicize anti-Semitism and say that the right is worse than the left. In our era, maybe the right was worse when, 70, 80 years ago. But today, the left is the worst enemy of the Jews. And Corbyn is just
And how would you explain Charlottesville and Pittsburgh? How do you explain?
George Soros funds the left.
How do you explain Charlottesville and Pittsburgh?
Hold on, Rabbi Katya, I got to interrupt. We're all, listen.
And anti-Semitism
Rabbi,
in the United States is fueled by the left.
okay, hold on. We're going to have a wonderful lecture by my colleague here, Harris Rafik, on the triple threat, the radical left, the radical right, and extreme Islam. Natan Sharansky, the chair of ISGAP, always says that we have to look at the different forms of anti-Semitism with an S in the contemporary context. Those who are affiliated with the right fight anti-Semitism on the right, those affiliated with the left fight it on the left, etc. So there's unfortunately a lot to go around, and Charlottesville, yes. Corbyn, yes. It's all horrible. Devin, the floor is
I just will say something very quickly to go back to your question about critical race theory. I think it's also important for us to understand that it may not be a central home in terms of having a body of knowledge, but I can't determine your lived reality and how your experiences are being defined. And I think that's something that we have to look back and understand. While we have different experiences, I can't interpret and appropriate your experience. Only you can share your story. And I think that's something that I don't want us to miss in, going back to, I think, Harry's point. We have to understand our stories matter. And that's what I really want our students to really think about, how those narratives are being mapped out. And I'm not coming to terms and defining it for them. They are defining themselves.
okay, so listen, we're over time, but we're going to continue it for a little bit longer. There's 3 people on the list that I'll call on. Please, unlike the previous questions, please ask a very concise question. Christine, Ben, and then Romy. We'll collect, excuse me, we're going to collect the questions. Christine, Ben, and Romy.
Yeah, this is a question for both of you. Have you read Learning from the Germans by Susan Neiman? It's Race and the Memory of Evil. And the reason why I bring it up and why I think it's relevant to both of your discourses today is because she was born Jewish in Atlanta. She grew up there, then she went to live in Berlin, then she went to live in Israel. She's now a director of an institute think tank in Berlin. But she took 3 years to write this work, and her whole work when she came back it explored 2 things, and for me it was very profound. And she really looked at East Germany and West Germany, and how had they dealt with what they were responsible for. And that was a very important distinction. And then she went and spent several years back in the South at the Confederacy issues, and Emmett Till and everything that came from there was an extraordinary repercussion out of the work. So I look forward to hearing what you think.
Thank you. Ben, very quick.
So I was just wondering what your thoughts were on the sort of reclamation that both the Jewish community and the black community has done on very similar racist policies that were done against them. You brought up the one-drop laws and then the Nuremberg conventions, which have been used to sort of by these communities to redefine ourselves, and what your thoughts on that phenomenon is and its impact on the creation of this large part of the communities which are passing invisible members of these communities.
And I'll just say very briefly, one of the things I do when I teach is teach students or help to teach students how to ask questions. And Ben, that was a very good question. Romy, briefly.
I just wanted to ask, so I'm from South Africa, and we had an issue with defining, because I was writing a piece on hate speech and against Jews in South Africa, and the question of who's a minority, who's a majority. So I can talk to you afterwards. It would just be really interesting.
It's the example that Barbara Fields gives.
Yeah, to get your perspective on defining who's a minority, who's a, the power dynamics and the racial issues and that come into play. So.
Please respond.
I will respond. I'll promise I'll be brief. I don't.
Unlike me.
I don't use the term minority in any of my research or dismiss it from any kind of text because it automatically creates a class division. And so I'm very careful about it, especially talking with my students about kind of looking at certain issues. So I don't use that terminology. The second I would say is we all bring, again, our own experiences into academics. When I look at the convergence between Jewish and African American communities, I'm looking specifically at organizations and the impact of large-scale organizations and what type of issues of access and who had access to. I'm also looking at spatial patterns of communities, how they change because of those institutions and their involvement, to kind of really answer a part of your question. I'll stop.
Oh, okay. So I, at the beginning of the semester, have a list of words that are not to be used. What happens if you take away certain words and you say they may not be used in my class, in your writing? It means you have to figure out what you want to say without using those words. If you have to say what you want to say without certain code words, you have to explain it. On that list is the word minorities for South Africa. Well, the minority were the Afrikaners. And we can talk about that after because that gets complicated. But I will say, for South Africa, as an example, those of you who really know about the anti-apartheid movement, then the name Joe Slovo and Ruth First immediately come to mind. Joe Slovo was very close to Nelson Mandela. He was head of the military wing. He was not claimed by the Jewish community until after Nelson Mandela had been freed, and he died, and suddenly the Board of Jewish Deputies came out and claimed him as one of his own. They had not claimed him as one of his own. For the United States, and especially for the South, Leo Frank is probably, might be a better example because it's local. And because the black community at the time wrote and said, and my book has a reference with a specific reference to it, is he a white person? Are Jews white? Question mark. And I had a student named Archie Tyson from Mississippi, the first year that I taught at Cornell. I'm going fast. And he left my class, he went home and he said to his brother, Jews aren't really white. And his brother said, yes, they are. And his grandmother overheard the conversation because he came back and told us. And his grandmother said, Jews aren't white. Okay, so that's generational. Who knows that? Finally, the name of the book by Eric Sundquist is Strangers in the Land, Blacks, Jews, Post-Holocaust America. It's issued by Harvard. He does a very good example of explaining why the coalitions came together and why it fell apart. And it's generational. It's also very generational. And the last thing, I never said Jews are a religion or an ethnicity or anything. Jews don't belong to any social science category. They do not. They are put in social science categories, but they do not. But it is also a fact that the law of return in Israel was deliberately, by a political government, chosen to be the same as the Nuremberg laws because of Hitler. And therefore, Russian Jews in particular, but not only, have a problem when they get to Israel because their fathers may be Jewish, which let them become Israeli, but they are not as Jewish. And therefore, and it was a big deal in Israel at the time, you can look it up, I don't need to explain to you, Jews who died, Israeli citizens who became Israeli through the law of return, but were not Jewish through their mother, were not buried in Jewish cemeteries. And so there were Russians who came to Israel and who were upset because they were not identified as Jews, even though they did everything. And the very, very last is that theories, to come back to your point, theories, like anything else, have a historiography to them. Critical race theory, named as critical race theory, critical legal studies, they are born in a place. They have a background, but they do also have authorship, totally taken out of context by all the people who talk about it and don't know anything about the history. So.
Everybody, thank you, Katya.
So you can continue. Anna Frank is very good, but there's some other young people who are